All right, good afternoon, everyone here in the room and also in Zoom. Welcome to our final CJS Winter 2025 lecture. Exciting. My name is Kirsten Sufert. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow with the center, and I had the pleasure of attending all of these wonderful lectures this year. Since this is our last event of the semester, there are no upcoming films or lectures to announce. Zanen desu ne. But thank you for joining us for our final lecture with Professor Julia Alekseyeva. So, for attendees in the Zoom space joining the webinar, webcams and microphones have been turned off. We invite you to use the Q&A function during the lecture to submit questions, and our presenter, who is me, will address as many as possible. The live transcription feature is enabled. If you'd rather not have captions, you can turn this feature off in the bottom right corner. And again, thank you so much for attending our lectures and events this semester, and we look forward to seeing you again when the lecture series returns in fall 2025. But before we start our talk today, I'd just like to take a moment to acknowledge the members of the CJS staff whose hard work and dedication made this year's lecture series and a lot of other events possible. So please join me in thanking Sarah Chittenden, Yuri Fukazawa, Jillian Locke, and Peggy Rudberg, who's not here. So thank you very much for your efforts. And today I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker, Professor Julia Alekseyeva. Dr. Alekseyeva is Assistant Professor of English and Cinema and Media Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. Her talk today stems from her first academic book, Antifascism and the Avant-Garde, Radical Documentary in the 1960s, which was just published this February by University of California Press. Her book builds off of longstanding work analyzing the interaction between radical media and leftist politics, particularly in Japan, France, and the Soviet Union, including the filmmaking and media theorization of Matsumoto Toshio, about which we will hear more soon. In addition to her academic work, Professor Alekseyeva is also a practicing cartoonist and author-illustrator of the award-winning graphic memoir, Soviet Daughter, A Graphic Revolution, published by Microcosm in 2017. And speaking for myself personally, it's inspiring to work with someone as community-focused and politically engaged as Professor Alekseyeva, and I'm sure we can expect more exciting things creatively and intellectually from her in the future. But for now, please join me in welcoming Julia to CJS.
Great, thank you so much, Kirsten, and thank you to Sarah and to Marcus Nornes and to everyone else here. It's so wonderful to be invited to talk about my work, and I'm so pleased by this reception and this thank you so much for the introduction, and I'll go ahead and get started. Sorry, I'm a little short. So normally, when someone gives a talk about film, we start the kind of introducing the film, and then you watch a clip, and then you keep talking about the film, but I actually want to show you a clip without a lot of introduction to the clip itself. And then I'll kind of go in and talk a little bit more about what you've just seen. So it will require a little bit of navigation. Just want to make sure the subtitles are on. Okay. So before I start my talk, I will just play the first 4 minutes or so of Matsumoto Toshio's 1959 film Anpo. And kind of warning, there are a lot of flashing lights. I should have noted. In terms of content, there's a little bit of kind of violence that you'll see, but most of the kind of violence is in the form of the film, even more than the actual content of the film. So.
戦争の足音がまた聞こえる。日本国はその防衛のための暫定措置として日本国に対する武力攻撃を阻止するため日本国内及びその付近にアメリカ合衆国がその軍隊を維持することを希望する安全保障条約。 から始まった民族の屈辱の歴史。ある日、アメリカ兵のいたずらの射撃が電車に乗っていた罪もない学生を撃ち殺したロングブリー事件。ママさん、カルティア。薬莢を拾いに行って犬のように一人の農夫が撃ち殺されたギラード事件。安全の名において召し上げられた先祖先代の4億坪の土地、600カ所を超えるアメリカ軍の基地がこうしてできた。安全保障とは、まず農民の頭を棍棒で殴りつけることから始まった。次に労働者を殴りつけた。明日戦争を起こそうとする者は、今日労働者階級の頭上に襲いかかるのだ。安保条約は自衛隊の増強を義務付けた。いかなる戦力も持つ意思はございません。自衛隊は軍隊ではありません。核武装はいたします。海外派兵、とんでもない。考えたこともありません。歴代の政府は武力を放棄した平和憲法の精神を踏み。
Just a moment while I return to. Beep. Thank you. Sorry. Okay. The title sequence of Matsumoto Toshio's short film Anpo Joyaku, or Anpo Treaty, released at the end of 1959, begins with several photographs depicting the rubble of a war-torn region, while the soundtrack joins occasional percussion with an unsettling electronic drone. As a politician's face is superimposed, cartoon-like, on the images of rubble and slowly grows larger, the background darkens and the voiceover begins. War's footsteps approach again. Japan, to take self-defense measures and to prevent armed attacks in Japan, hopes the United States of America keeps its military in and around Japan, the U.S.-Japan's Treaty of Mutual Cooperation and Security, ANPO. We are meant to read hope ironically, just as the narrator delivers the last word, ANPO, a term with massive psychological and historical pathos in the context of 1960s Japan, with enormous generation-defining protests against its ratification. The image was reversed into a film negative. A beat later, the viewer sees and hears the explosion of a bomb, followed by archival footage of war and destruction. The unsettling stasis of the first few seconds of still photographs is violently exploded. Starting around the time of the film's release and continuing well into 1960, Japan would see the largest protests in modern Japanese history against the controversial U.S.-Japan Security Treaty known as ANPO, which allowed the United States to maintain military bases on Japanese soil. As the Cold War progressed, the U.S. attempted to strategically use the unique geographic position of Japan to keep communism at bay. The United States leadership reinstated former war criminals into positions of power. One of these war criminals, Kishinobusuke, eventually became prime minister. On June 15, 1960, Japan would see, as Nick Kapoor writes, the climax of what were, by almost any measure, the largest and longest series of popular protests in Japan's history. For 15 months, from March 1959 through June 1960, an estimated 30 million people from across the archipelago, approximately one-third of Japan's population of 92.5 million, participated in protest activities. This was a highly politicized era. It was one in which everyday citizens who still remembered the trauma of war saw collaboration with the warmongering Americans as a potential return to a fascist past. Article 9 of the 1945 Japanese Constitution, drafted at the behest of the United States, prevented Japan from participating in military endeavors. Yet Japanese leftists knew that while Japan held a global image as a peaceful nation in the wake of the catastrophe of the Second World War, in reality, Japan was complicit in continued imperialist terror. Anpo Joyaku uses tricks of editing and cinematography to unsettle the viewer and support its virulently anti-war and anti-Anpo message. A broken window pane flickers on screen, juxtaposed with an image of a U.S. soldier accused of killing a Japanese citizen. India ink flows across still images of women, symbolic of sexual violence. A photograph of Kishi Nobusuke breaks like porcelain into 9 pieces, revealing a caricature of Kishi in a military helmet. A claw-like hand unfolds, Nosferatu-like, over a map of the world, symbolizing the evils of American imperial hegemony. You can see this on the bottom right of the screen, and indeed the vampiric nature of Cold War capitalism. Matsumoto's controversial film demonstrated his belief in the power of experimental techniques in documentary to reveal the normally hidden. While avowedly a work of propaganda, Anpo Joyaku uses its myriad editing experiments to destabilize common conceptions and drum up support for the struggle against Anpo. As director Nagano Chiaki wrote in his review of Anpo Joyaku, the film creates new ways of expression and crystallizes his theory of documentary creation. These formal methods, though, have an avowedly political purpose. And he writes, Matsumoto draws out the helpless and oppressive consciousness that has been buried deep in our bodies in the 14 years since the end of World War II. It confronts it with historical reality. It's meant to be transformed into something real. He is trying to approach the complexity of everyday reality by stripping the subject of images of the everyday, using powers unique to film. Rather than a style of propaganda that supports widely understood notions and deeply held beliefs, Matsumoto's film strips, and the Japanese here is literally strip off the veil, or veiru hagitori, commonly seen images, confronting them with a historical reality which had been buried deep. This unveiling, however, can only occur using powers unique to film. Following Matsumoto and Nagano, I argue that experimental documentary such as Anpo Joyaku performs this anti-fascist unveiling process by instigating an effective shock to the senses. The rapid-fire and wide-ranging editing emphasizing tricks associated with the surrealist avant-garde is meant to confront the viewer directly, implicating them in the current political situation of Japan. While this directly shocking mechanism would change slightly over the next several years, in the early 1960s, short political documentary used disorientation as an effective strategy to render the viewer complicit in the continuation of fascist policies, in the hope of instigating radicalization, self-critique, and then political action. What Matsumoto will soon call the neo-documentary answers the call for a documentary filmmaking that breaks with wartime ideology in content and in form. Leftist filmmakers and theorists frequently discussed fascism and imperialism, especially during the heyday of the Anpo struggle. This was true in Japan as well as elsewhere, especially in Western Europe. Nazi Germany was a constant reference point, largely due to a strong understanding of documentary film as a medium complicit in, and in fact inextricable from, wartime propaganda. In Japan, film critics such as the Marxist Iwasaki Akira, central theorist for proletarian film, spoke of Japan's need to come to terms with its complicity during the Pacific War. For Iwasaki, because so many contemporary critics shared responsibility for horrors committed during wartime, engaging in ethical and enlightened film criticism required a coming to terms with one's past, what the voiceover of Anpo Joyaku terms the traces on their skin. This language of surreal and uncanny embodiment in which fascism and imperialism continued to leave quasi-supernatural traces on skin is echoed by many theoretical texts of the era. Critics constantly reiterate that this task is both external and internal. Fascism cannot only be confronted externally in protests or penned proclamations. It must also be vanquished at the level of individual psychology. The stage for the defeat of fascism is both the public square and the psychoanalyst's couch, or more precisely, the mirror. As Matsumoto argues in an article written approximately coterminous with the creation of Anpo Joyaku, quote, "It is through post-war responsibility that we unabashedly examine the negative ideological structure that permeates our war and post-war experiences, recognizing the somber truth," end quote. A revolution experienced on the ground must necessarily interweave dialectically with a revolution experienced internally, with an examination of the somber truth of post-war responsibility. Revolutionary art was key for this dual revolutionary dialectic of the internal and the external. Matsumoto Toshio argued that anti-fascist art must not attempt to tie up the mysterious and the poetic, the unknown and unseen neatly into a rational and scientific bow. In the field of documentary, a medium so frequently and perhaps singularly complicit in the upholding of fascistic power relations, anti-fascist work should not strive to inoculate the viewer with the ideology of truth with a capital T, but should aim to unveil, estrange, and re-enchant. It should inspire and empower the viewer to perform the analytical work themselves. In my book, Antifascism and the Avant-Garde, Radical Documentary in the 1960s, just published by UC Press, I argue that this idea was shared among many communist documentary filmmakers of the 1960s, including Jean-Luc Godard, Agnes Varda, Hani Susumu, Chris Marker, Imamura Shohei, and others. This talk demonstrates how Matsumoto Toshio considered his philosophy of film as fundamentally anti-fascist in nature. I argue that his work embodies the anti-fascist potential of avant-garde documentary form, how it can be anti-fascist through an interweaving of anti-fascist form with anti-fascist content. My book answers the question, what is anti-fascist documentary, by arguing that the project of anti-fascist media must entail a critical and questioning lens, a challenging of knowledge production and the status quo via what film theorists Annette Michelson and Diane Rodowick, after Hegel and Marx, term epistemological struggle. Experimental filmmaking and editing techniques are usually essential to induce this rupture of consciousness, one that joins difficulty and sometimes violent discomfort, what Japanese theorist and filmmaker Matsumoto Toshio calls the sadomasochistic aesthetic, with affects of liveliness, play, and even pleasure. The goal of this struggle is personal and political emancipation through a revitalization of perception, both an estrangement and a surrealist reenchantment that makes life, in Svetlana Boym's words, lively and worth living. This project traces its argument to anti-fascist documentary theorists and filmmakers in France and Japan during the 60s. It charts a trajectory of interrelated movements that respond to their specific historical and national contexts, yet are fiercely and consciously intertwined in transnational debates around Marxist political aesthetics. Although the book looks at a larger transnational ethos, Matsumoto is the book's central theorist. His decades of work in intermedial and expanded media practice have recently received scholarly attention, primarily through studies by Miriam Sass, Yuri Furuhata, Michael Rain, and others. But in the US today, he is best known for the '69 queer avant-garde quasi-documentary Funeral Parade of Roses, or Bara no Soretsu, which transplanted the story of Oedipus Rex onto the gay boy culture of Tokyo. Although Matsumoto was not himself gay, his portrayal of explicitly queer or gay boy, and the terms queer and gay boy are not quite aligned, but I can talk about that a little bit more in the Q&A if there's interest. That his portrayal of explicitly queer subjects with queer performers, as well as its fervently experimental aesthetic, is as provocative today as it was at the end of the 1960s. Yet the film does not present queerness with uplifting narratives, nor with the inclusion of tragic, faultless martyrs. I align with Jonathan M. Hall, who argues that Funeral Parade's aberrant, quote-unquote, sexuality was neither pastoral utopian nor redemptive and political, but a mode of address that shared with the political tropes of repetition, claims to authority, as well as the possibility of shattering rupture. And shattering rupture is indeed key. Matsumoto's films and writings perform a criticism of the external world, usually through Marxism, as well as the internal world through relentless self-critique. Before Funeral Parade of Roses, Matsumoto had made a name for himself by creating what he called neo-documentaries, his neologism for politically engaged avant-garde documentary works. These include Bicycle or Ginrin from 1955, the aforementioned Anpo Joyaku, The Weavers of Nishijin from 1961, Song of the Stone or Ishi no Ota from 1963, and others. Matsumoto was also one of the foremost intellectuals and critics of his day, uniquely attuned to global philosophical and aesthetic trends. His favorite filmmakers were surrealist Louis Buñuel and spearhead of the French New Wave left bank Hélène René, both of whom merged formal experimentation with their firmly communist beliefs. This was also the case with his most major Japanese philosophical influence, theorists of the avant-garde Hanada Kyoteru. He was also extremely interested in Eastern European, especially Polish cinema from the post-war period. Philosophically, his influences were broad, ranging from existentialism to phenomenology, and include philosophers Friedrich Nietzsche, Georges Bataille, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, Jean-Paul Sartre, and Simone de Beauvoir. Most crucially, he grafted his Marxism to a deep concern with psychoanalysis and the unconscious through the work of Sigmund Freud. These and many more are referenced as explicit sources of influences in his critical work, so there's a lot more that he was probably influenced by, but these come up more than any other in his work. In geographic scope, politics, and fierce attention to the formal dimensions of his craft, Matsumoto may be one of the world's foremost theorists of the politics of documentary. He belongs to a rare breed of filmmaker theorists in the vein of Jean-Luc Godard, Sergei Eisenstein, Zika Vertov, Fernando Solanas, and Harun Faraki, whose engagement with militant politics overlaps with their intersections of documentary and fiction. Aesthetically, all these figures also align with what Diane Radowick describes as political modernism. Viewing Matsumoto alongside these figures allows us to see him as a figure woven into a transnational circuit of unorthodox communist filmmakers and thinkers whose goal was to unveil the political and ideological aspects of aesthetic critique and technique. Like these filmmakers, Matsumoto aimed for his art to serve a revolutionary purpose, and by which I mean it is fundamentally anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist, and anti-American. However, Matsumoto is original amongst these filmmaker theorists in his elevation of the psychology of the individual artist and in his concern with individual complicity. As we will see, self-analysis is essential to his politics. Matsumoto helmed Kiroku Eiga, or documentary film, which ran from 1958 to 1964 and might be one of the most theoretically and internationally engaged journals exclusively focused on documentary and cinema history. This journal provided an important outlet for Matsumoto to disseminate his challenging ideas, often offensively critical of his peers and outrageously diatribe-like, but always fiercely Marxist. By his own admission, his prose is also notoriously hard to understand. In Michael Rain's introduction to the only currently published translation of Matsumoto's written work to date, he calls Matsumoto's often repetitive prose incantatory. Matsumoto's films are similarly challenging, yet their difficulty is, in fact, the point. They are meant to embody a rupture of consciousness through the process of watching and of reading. So I believe both his films and his writing, there's a kind of praxis of difficulty in both of these works, in all of these works. They embody an ethos and politic through and of aesthetic form. As such, Matsumoto aligns with Marxist traditions that refuse the doctrine of ease and instead view criticism as an evocative art form in its own right. Matsumoto held a surrealist interest in unveiling what he called the unreality of the quotidian, in which the everyday and capitalist imperialism held any number of seemingly invisible fascist aggressions. He also believed that avant-garde documentary was the privileged mode of filmmaking in its unique ability to express both internal and external worlds. His mobilization of documentary, whether it's through his neo-documentaries or the highly experimental Funeral Parade of Roses, aligned with the rejection of laws and norms that Julian Borg describes as integral to the 1960s spirit. As Borg writes, was normalcy tantamount to normalization? Was psychiatry merely the furthest reach of an array of social and political institutions whose intention, or at least effective function, was to quiet all kinds of rebellion? Was it not society itself that was mad? Matsumoto Toshio came to embody anti-fascist criticism around 1960 as a member of a new generation of artists who grappled with the trauma of the Pacific War. World War II is not just the specter haunting Matsumoto's work, it suffuses it fully. References to Japanese wartime fascism are relentless. The intention is indeed sadistic, meant to push his readers and audience into a confrontation with their own previously fascist ways of thinking and being in the world, a source of great shame. While he was only one of many filmmakers associated with the Japanese political avant-garde of the 1960s who grappled with the trauma of the Pacific War, his work most explicitly ties the everyday practice of anti-fascism to art, and specifically to the avant-garde documentary. Matsumoto argued that art must reject systematization, unity, and a single meaning for it to be anti-fascist. It must question reality. It must unnerve and estrange. For a documentary specifically to function as anti-fascist, it must include elements of the irrational. As he writes, it, quote, must be rejected by a politics of art which cannot help but transform the self and others in turn, end quote. Such techniques, primarily drawn from the surrealist experiments of the 1920s, fight against the forces of reactionary complacency that Matsumoto connects to a fascist mindset. Matsumoto described his mode of avant-garde filmmaking in the 1960s as reconciling two competing tendencies of early film history. These twin tendencies were discovery or nonfiction on one hand, represented by the Lumiere brothers, and creation or fiction on the other, represented by Georges Méliès. Many political filmmakers, from Jean-Luc Godard to Joris Ivens, Agnes Varda to Sergei Yurkevich, reject the assumed eternal fracture between these two genres and argue of the embeddedness of the fictional within the document and the document within the fictional. And many of these figures, like Matsumoto, ruptured this assumed dichotomy by creating experimental documentaries. Matsumoto goes further, however, in arguing for avant-garde documentary as the only anti-fascist documentary style of the post-war period, and the only one that responds accurately to current historical conditions. Individual creativity, and specifically the dismantling of the artist's consciousness, a fundamentally masochistic drive, is key for the project of revolution, according to Matsumoto. Matsumoto fervently rejected public relations or PR films, which cropped up at the end of World War II in Japan. As Matsumoto writes in an excerpt translated by Marcus Nornes, thank you, Marcus, and a lot of my work is very, very indebted to your work in documentary, so believe me that the book has many, many, many citations from your work. Lacking principles, this is a quote by Matsumoto, lacking principles, documentary filmmakers adapted to the PR film industry in a period of retreat. Here, consistent from start to finish, there were only slavish craftsmen lacking subjectivity. In a June 1958 article from the introductory issue of Kiroku Eiga, so this was the very, very, very first issue that of this journal that he was editing, so a very, very big deal. Matsumoto explicitly ties imperialism and fascism to the suppression of creativity witnessed by PR films. And he writes, and I'll just read out this quote, it's long, but I think it's good, so I'll just read it out. We can say that the outside world is that which suppresses my artistic creativity and seeks to dismantle me through the murderous mechanism of making vulgar PR films, labor intensification and low wages, exploitation and oppression, the resurrected sound of military boots, the rapid resurgence of monopoly capital, dreaming of imperial independence, Okinawa, Tunisia, the dangers of Wall Street and the atomic and hydrogen bomb wars, the emasculated and fetishized many. A true avant-garde fights uncompromisingly with this sick part, the energy of the this is the whole, all one sentence, so this gives you a sense for his style of writing. It's so bombastic, and there are a lot of, I think you can make a lot of connections to Deleuze, which I'll talk about in a bit. The energy of the masses is like a dormant volcano. It is interlocked with the self-aware organization centered on the proletariat class. It is a history of struggle, revolution, the progress of the peace movement on an international scale, the struggle for freedom and independence, and the conviction of human liberation. The inner world is my anger, sorrow, suffering, joy, etc., towards the outer world. It is an ideology and a passion that seeks to achieve the emancipation of the self and the transformation of the external world by engaging itself to the avant-garde of history. When I say that I perceive and express reality subjectively, I must perceive both the outside and interior holistically. Here, Matsumoto ties self and world emancipation, noting that both are necessary for the struggle for liberation. He argues that an artist must be an avant-gardist who fights uncompromisingly with the sick part of society, in contrast to the emasculated and fetishized many. Elsewhere in Kiroku Eiga, Matsumoto criticizes the fetishization of the masses. For the most part, he writes, the masses have absolutely no self. They are closely tied to dogmatism, blindly enforcing the policies of authoritative leaders. Yet Matsumoto's distrust of the masses should not be read as a pro-capitalist sentiment of the individual against the collective. For Matsumoto, the masses do not exist as a uniform organizational body. Each citizen must perform an internal transformation that is carried out into the external world through revolutionary acts. For Matsumoto, the avant-garde documentary aids the transformation of consciousness and the emancipation of the self. It is not mere form, but an ideology and a passion that fights uncompromisingly with militarization and proto-fascism. I want to return to Matsumoto's more expansive notion of fascism, which can be productively compared to the definition of what French theorists Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari described as microfascism, which finds fascism in microspheres of everyday life as well as the usual social and political venues, and aims to understand fascism's emergent dimensions, the subtle dynamics in play before historical expressions manifest. Their definition likewise expands beyond a fascism witnessed in actually existing ultra-right-wing parties, although it certainly and necessarily includes them. Deleuze and Guattari's study of fascism in relation to what they term schizoanalysis as opposed to psychoanalysis in their 1972 Anti-Oedipus might, as Michel Foucault postulates, be alternately titled An Introduction to a Non-Fascist Life. In his preface to Anti-Oedipus, he writes that Deleuze and Guattari's concept of fascism is not only historical fascism, the fascism of Hitler and Mussolini, but also the fascism in us all, in our heads and in our everyday behavior, the fascism that causes us to love power, to desire the very thing that dominates us and exploits us. Jack Bradich describes that this type of fascism focused on the subtle dynamics of the everyday that emerge before historical conditions manifest. As Deleuze and Guattari write, rural fascism and city or neighborhood fascism, youth fascism, and the war veterans fascism, every fascism is defined by a micro black hole that stands on its own and communicates with the others. This, I think, relates to what Matsumoto described as the fascism of the Japanese tanarigumi or neighborhood associations. That tanarigumi were created for the explicit purpose of national control and were the smallest unit of national mobilization during World War II. One can analyze the tanarigumi, which continue to exist in some capacity to this day, as a fascist equivalent of mutual aid organizations. Participation was mandatory, and each unit was responsible for allocating goods, spreading propaganda, and the maintenance of public security. In effect, it was an organization meant to surveil and exert control over a small number of citizens from the top down. The tanarigumi mentality appears as an ideal encapsulation of the micro-fascist mentality within the sphere of the everyday. Matsumoto's critique of the tanarigumi points to his fundamentally surrealist interest in unveiling what he calls the unreality of the quotidian, in which the everyday and capitalist imperialism held any number of seemingly invisible fascist aggressions. The last 3 minutes of Anpo Joyaku illustrate Matsumoto's attempt to link the everyday with imperialist and fascist horror. And I'm going to play this scene, which is at the very end of this short film. The scene begins with gruesome scenes of war, so, content warning, and again, a formal warning for the strobe lights and flickering. Then an optimistic and galvanizing scene of Anpo protesters, in which you can see the infamous snake dance that protesters used to evade police capture. But the film ends, however, with quotidian life and finally with the atomic bomb. So I'll just show this. Ooh. Oh boy. Where are we at?
嫌だ。戦争は嫌だ。戦争への道は日本民族の破滅への行進だ。目をつむれない、口を閉じられない。戦争の危険が迫っているとき、もう黙っていられない。我々の国の海に招かざる外国の船が怒りを下ろしている限り、地に中員がむ手に銃を持ち、村に町に兵隊がいる限り、彼らの翼が死と闇を乗せて国中を飛び回っている限り、戦争の危険が迫っているとき、もう黙っていられない。目をつむれない、口を閉じられない、怒りを隠せない。我々は立ち上がる、我慢できない。愛する我らの国のために。 戦争の危機が近づいている。無気力、無関心、小さな利己心、マスコミの魔術、それらは彼らに味方する。嫌だ。戦争は嫌だ。
Is there a way to return to the PowerPoint? Oh, sorry, thanks. Okay, great, thank you. Matsumoto's work aims to engage a politics of affect through what he calls an aesthetic sadomasochism. In an article titled, and this is very typical of the way that he titles his articles, Consciousness of the Aesthetic Sadomasochist, or On the Internal Process of Creation and Its Artistic Utility, an article published in Kiroku Eiga in February 1960, in which I've translated for the Journal of Cinema and Media Studies in an article coming out next month. Matsumoto criticizes educational documentary by noting that the artist must not be a teacher, merely inoculating the viewer with truth. So I won't read out the entire quote in the interest of time, but so this is just the beginning of this article by Matsumoto. But I want to emphasize Matsumoto's critique of documentary films for being either educational or instructional, and taking their cues from what he calls Enlightenment era positivism. He also criticizes them for being regressive, for continuing to fetishize the previous century's tailbones. Instead, he then writes that these regressive and reactionary qualities of contemporary documentary must be denied, and this is in his words, must be denied by an artistic propaganda which strikes within oneself, is knocked back, and transforms itself as well as others spontaneously. And this is what Matsumoto means when he describes an aesthetic sadomasochism in the article's title. It is a leftist autocritique which marries political ideology to self-analysis. The context of Matsumoto's writing is a criticism of an alleged claim to knowledge when confronted with political hypocrisy, and the terror of potential imperial remilitarization. For Matsumoto, film needed to confront, quote, the consciousness of those who had to face the execution of criminal war leaders with complicated feelings, and the consciousness of those who are trying to reflect on their own experiences, end quote. In this article, Matsumoto notes that Prime Minister Kishi Nobusuke was, quote, all of these, if I'm just going to stop saying quote unquote, it's just awkward. So assume that if it's in Matsumoto's voice with all of these bombastic claims, it's by Matsumoto. Prime Minister Kishi Nobusuke was a war criminal fascist and continues to be a war criminal fascist. And the Japanese monopoly capital and its government are now becoming newly imperialist. There is thus a particular need to address wartime experiences and war responsibility in the contemporary moment. For Matsumoto, in order for documentary to overcome its roots in an outdated positivism, it must include elements of the irrational, and here is where sadomasochism comes in. Film must sadistically reveal the irrationality of the external world and penetrate deep with the scalpel of criticism, while masochistically dismantling the artist's consciousness. This, importantly, is nothing less than a daily conversion. Without it, as he writes, the distance from here to war propaganda movies is not far. What Matsumoto calls aesthetic sadomasochism, then, is nothing less than anti-fascism as a daily practice. Matsumoto's concept of autocritique, of looking inwards to transform the external world, has much in common with the project of surrealism, what Donald Lacrosse describes, following Michael Lowy, as a romantic anti-capitalism, an independent, revolutionary Hegelo-Marxist dialectics barbed with strikingly original libertarian impulses, which underscores the internal necessity of binding internal revolts of consciousness to outbursts of insurgent collective action. Like Deleuze and Guattari, Matsumoto's Marxism aimed to cleave individual and internal revolt to the project of revolution. It is, in fact, revolt's prerequisite. The filmmakers I discuss in my project, such as Agnes Varda, Chris Marker, Hani Susumu, Imamura Shohei, and Jean-Luc Godard, all see the anti-fascist avant-garde documentary as a critical mode of activation and enlivening. This emphasis on life contrasts with what Bradich describes as death-style fascism, what Deleuze and Guattari describe on capitalism and following Nietzsche as the ascetic ideal, the cultural extract, judging life, belittling life. Everything labors for death, everything wishes for death. In these last few minutes, I want to bring our attention to the contemporary landscape and the relevance of these various theorists to the present day. It is my belief that the lessons of the films and debates featured in this book connect crucially to our contemporary moment in two ways. One, in their emphasis on media literacy, and two, in their connection to the project of abolition. First, the concern for media literacy is not new. Social science disciplines have especially embraced the notion that the media we consume needs to be decoded, assessed, and thoughtfully and consciously created. The 1960s communist experimental documentary filmmakers questioned images as a transparent link to indexical reality. There are parallels, in fact, to the AI-generated images of today and the inability to separate truthful images from their #deepfake versions. Soon, no amount of close analysis will be able to tell the image from its simulacrum. By the way, I hate saying hashtag out loud. Apologies for that, just gross. Another approach is needed, as the 60s theorists anticipated far ahead of their time. Yet their models were far more radical and liberation-minded than the models of today, and more interwoven with debates in philosophy and cultural studies. This concern with media literacy is crucially connected to the way we perceive and interpret the world. We imagine that our access to truth and our moral rectitude allows us to viciously critique others, but we so rarely point the critique inwards towards ourselves. This is a carceral framework, and it is this that connects media literacy crucially to the work of abolition. It is not an accident that the oft-repeated phrase, "kill the cop inside your head," originated with the protests of May 1968. The phrase "chassez les flics de votre tête," or technically "get the cop out of your head," appeared on the cover of the January 1969 short-lived journal Action and became associated with an anti-authoritative leftism. And I was very excited that I got to actually reproduce this image in my book by contacting the granddaughter of one of the artists, who said that the project kind of aligns with her grandfather's ideology, and she was very excited. So I'm very, very happy that this image is in the book, because it's one of my favorites. This phrase aligns the abolition of the carceral state directly with anti-fascism and is linked to Deleuze and Guattari's anti-Oedipus. For Deleuze and Guattari, capitalism arouses a desire for control of others and oneself, what they call asceticism, and modern life is defined by this warped internalized carcerality. Crucial to my argument is that the tie between the technique of film form and its ability to radically affect the way we perceive reality. In an interview from 1962, Agnes Varda claimed that film can condition us. It can liberate and reframe what restrains our thinking and feeling. But the stakes of this argument also exceed the confines of film or even media at large. At heart, this argument is also about the process by which we can counter fascism in our ways of acting, thinking, and feeling, and in the way we treat others. However, this process is not meant to be self-punishing, and it is not an accident that Matsumoto uses the term sadomasochism to refer to his aesthetic form, because this difficult process of self-transformation was actually meant to be pleasurable as well as difficult. Matsumoto's films are difficult and sometimes frustrating, but they are also fun and tremendously lively and effectively powerful. Foucault reminds us that Deleuze and Guattari do not think that one needs to be sad in order to be militant. The often pleasurable affects of the films discussed in my book are embodied in the personal as well as the political, and follow Lauren Berlant's description of affective atmospheres and cruel optimism, which are shared and not solitary. Borrowing Raymond Williams's concept of the structures of feeling, Berlant argues that affective responses may be said significantly to exemplify shared historical time. Berlant writes alongside Brian Masumi's conceptualization of affect as a proto-political transversality, a process which cannot be characterized as exclusively subjective or objective. Miriam Sass uses the term affective scale to describe Matsumoto Toshio, as she calls his work a continuum between subjective, personal, and larger structures. Sass, Berlant, Masumi, Matsumoto, Deleuze and Guattari, among others, such as Sian Nai and Sarah Ahmed, demonstrate, in the words of Nai, how feeling can be used to expand the project of criticism and theory. This book considers how a certain quality of affect can be mobilized, according to Nai, this word mobilization, and how we can consider it in tandem with a radical epistemology as integral to the project of revolutionary becoming. Affect, pleasure, and anti-fascism are not usually discussed alongside one another, and most analyses of anti-fascism writ large occur in explicitly militant presses such as Haymarket, Common Notions, Verso, or Counterpoint. Writing for the latter, Patrick Nathan, in Image Control, Art, Fascism, and the Right to Resist, posits a certain pleasure in anti-fascist artwork that resists ease, passivity, and commodification. While certain filmmakers, namely Godard, and I criticize Godard a little bit in my book for this, balk at the idea of a pleasurable anti-fascism, Nathan singles out films by David Lynch and Krzysztof Kieslowski that shock, disrupt, and estrange, but do not reject affect. Nathan writes, "There are people, me included, who find great pleasure in being so changed, so destroyed." And this is especially topical given the recent memorials to the late David Lynch. It's awkward to quote myself, but I did write about this in a recent interview with Kristen Gozzi in Jacobin. But if the recent deluge of heartwarming elegies on social media for David Lynch has anything to teach us, it's that film doesn't have to be simple or easy to be beloved. Heck, it doesn't even have to make sense. To estrange from the familiar, to shift perspective becomes a radical act. Everyday anti-fascism entails an ontological and epistemological struggle that can be both painful and pleasurable, a different form of enjoyment from passive audience reception of a Hollywood film. It is a feeling resolutely unfamiliar, its path unknown and unknowable. It is a process of surrender, of desubjectification, a shedding of old skins, but it is a path that brings us, in Ziga Vertov's words, the viewer back to life through what he called cinematic sensation. This is a very specific to the Soviet Union, a Russian word called kinoощущение. What for Matsumoto are unknown and unseeable things, or mianaimono, must be brought to the surface. The connection, likewise, to surrealism, to myth, poetry, and madness is key, for, as Bataille argues, fascism is not rational. It will not be defeated by reason and argumentation. Bataille claims that anti-fascism must stoke a passion for democracy and a delight in its disorders. It is meaningful also that contemporary critics like Silvia Federici and my friend Jackie Wang, abolitionist poet and author of Carceral Capitalism, are engaged in a project of re-enchantment. Wang's work argues that the very ability to imagine different and better worlds is tied to dreaming, to communist affect, to Freud's oceanic feeling, and to radical acts of imagination. Radical art making in the vein of Matsumoto can never replace the work of abolitionist organizing and anti-fascism in the streets, but it necessitates it and requires it to create conditions of liberatory perception, what I call revolutionary phenomenology, and to make our own world livable in the first place. In the last paragraph of the coda of my book, which I wrote in 2023, I quoted my friend Ariel Angel, editor-in-chief of Jewish Kuritz, who wrote in 2022, so 3 years ago, "These days, I feel the threat of fascism humming in my body like a once broken bone before the rain." Today, fascism in the US is not a mere threat, but an ever-expanding and terrifying presence, a death style. Perhaps it might sound strange to claim that it is precisely in this moment that Matsumoto's film philosophy is most needed, its rejection of positivism, its mobilizing and agitational affects, and perhaps more than anything, its demand for the acknowledgement of our own complicity in atrocities beyond our worst nightmares. It is my belief that this artful self-reckoning and self-revolution are essential to the project of imagining a new and better world. Thank you. So I'd be happy to, or would you like to field the Q&A? I'm happy to field the Q&A or answer any questions, and I think there's plenty of time for.
Sure, we'll have to bounce back and forth between the Zoom and in person. So we'll start with in person. Looks like Marcus is ready to go, so let's start here.
Thanks. This was really fun. I love Matsumoto.
See, it's fun. He's fun. That's the thing people, I see these things, say these things about, it's about recognizing your complicity, but also it's really fun to watch his films.
Yeah, CJS brought him to the Ann Arbor Film Festival. Wow. I don't know, maybe 15, 20 years ago.
Wow.
Yeah. And that people loved him here. Yeah. So you've chosen to focus on his most overtly political film, Insecurity Treaty.
Yeah.
So I'd love to hear you account for other aspects of his career, which is really pretty diverse, particularly since you're thinking about interiority and affect onto the world.
Yeah.
This thread of, I guess, Buddhist films like Atman and Shikisoku Zeiku, especially.
Yeah.
And then what do you do with space projection Ako and his participation in Bampo and pretty he seems to pretty much evacuate the politics you seem to be interested in for pretty much the rest of his career.
Yeah, it's such a good question, and his work is so it has so many different evolutions, and I agree, especially after 1973. One of the arguments that I make in my book that's also tied to one of the articles from the and it's been in your chapter in the Pink film volume, which is that after 1973, there really is something like a vibe shift in global cinema, actually. It's not just Japan, but people that otherwise were very politically oriented in their filmmaking retreat. And so you see this not just in Matsumoto, right? Of course, you also see this with Hani Susumu, who then becomes a kind of known for nature documentaries, and that's what he continues to be known for today, the average Japanese person, even though his earlier work was so politically engaged. But even after 1960, his neo-documentaries, I think they are extremely political, but they're not as overtly propagandistic, and he does talk about Ampo as being a propaganda film, and that being something that he wants to do. Of course, everyone probably knows this, but propaganda was not a negative term for people at that point, especially. And in this film, there's even a kind of cringy, awkward section that is very praising of the Soviet Union in ways where there's this awkward, Busby Berkeley-esque display of bodies in a Soviet parade, and from my perspective, I'm like, oh, this is really horrifying, but actually was supposed to be seen as really lovely, in Matsumoto's film. So I would also argue that this film is his most kind of Soviet connected. I wondered whether that had something to do with the. He was more connected to the party, to the Communist Party, and also the workers' clubs where this film would screen, and so it already had a more kind of Communist Party dimension to it. But one of the reasons I chose this particular film is because I think it's really hard to find, and I wanted to show people one of his most. This was a very, very topical film for discussion at the time of its release, but it's very, very hard to see now. And so part of it is kind of the showing of something that's relatively rare. Like, it's not included in his collected DVD, 4-disc DVD. I've been trying to find it for years. Finally, I saw it on film at Japan Cuts in New York, I think something like 5 years ago, and then tried to find it again, got a secret screener, that disappeared. So basically, it's always the mysterious how one accesses these things. And for this particular one, I actually had to I messaged the rights holder on Instagram, who then responded surprisingly quickly, and I was able to legally screen it at one of my book launch events, which was really cool. But they made sure you can't send this around. It's all very secretive, So so I wanted to show something that was very popular, but just people might not have themselves experienced or seen this particular film. And I am particularly interested, perhaps personally most interested in this era, because it doesn't have that sense of Zatsukan, or that like disappointment or failure that you really see in the post-1960 films, because I just find it so galvanizing, this type of more propagandistic filmmaking. But I think the argument about complicity and this perceptual shift, even if the post-1973 kind of perception-oriented and very Buddhist films, I think there's still a through line, in terms of this concept of perception. So I'm actually in the process of trying to put together a book proposal for Duke with a colleague at USC, Amy Poncher, because we want to there really isn't a lot written explicitly about Matsumoto in English, and there's of course very, very little translated because it's so hard to translate. And not only do you have to be fluent in Japanese, but you have to have read Freud, and you have to have read Bataille, and you have to have read Sartre. And so to already have all of these these sources of influence and these concepts in your brain while reading them. So we're trying to put together a kind of Matsumoto's film philosophy type of edited collection. And one of the topics that we want to kind of think about specifically as his work is quite, I would argue, like kaleidoscopic. Like he has this interest in perception. He has this anti-fascist dimension, which is what I'm talking about. But then he also has, this dimension of the subject-object and this kind of dialectic that he's talking about, and what most people, when they've written about in the English context, have talked about that. But then there's also this Buddhist part, that hasn't really been treated. So it's still very early in this process of trying to figure out how we're approaching his work, which is quite vast in its influences. But I don't necessarily see the kind of future Buddhist, especially expanded media Buddhist aspect of Matsumoto as being so dissimilar. It's on a historical trajectory, and he changes his mind and he works with other things, but it's also something that, not necessarily the Buddhist connection, but the retreat into and it is a retreat into the museum context and the academic context. It's something that was relatively ubiquitous, actually, all around the world with leftist filmmakers. So it's interesting why, there are many kind of hypotheses about why that happened, but you do see it kind of like between 1973 and 1974, something changes. But yeah, I hope that answers your question, but thanks so much. Yeah.
Great, we have some questions popping up in the Zoom, so let's bounce back and forth. This question is from Max Swanson, who thanks you for your talk. Max asks, are there contemporary films or filmmakers that you see as working in this lineage or tradition and or embodying a version of Matsumoto's avant-garde aesthetic for our current iterations of micro and macro fascisms?
I love this question. I love this question also because I don't know if other people have had this experience when they're done with their first book, and then there are so many other book projects I want to do now that I'm like, oh, I want to do the book about this. I want to do a book about this. And so one of the things that I want to write a book about is geared towards the kind of more public, non-academic audience. So I'm pitching it to Verso next month. We'll see how that will go. But it's on, I'm calling it something like Cinema or Barbarism, a 21st Century Syllabus. And it's actually thinking specifically about this question of what filmmakers are doing this work today. And it might not necessarily be the specifically Matsumoto-esque sadomasochistic style. But I think there's a really interesting turn to the quasi-documentary within global the word global has so much heft, and so does transnational, so I'm not sure how I want to use that word or the word transnational, but in terms of transnational leftism, there is such an interest these days in work that is actively trying to uncomfortably bridge the documentary and the fictional. Radu Jude is like one of my favorite filmmakers today. I think his work, he's a Romanian filmmaker, part of the New Wave. His work is extremely funny, but also very, very, very dark. His last film was called Do Not Expect Too Much from the End of the World, and it follows most of the story is fictional, but then there are kind of interviews that are woven in, and a kind of documentary style, kind of intertitles with kind of a tracking shot with graves along the roadside. It's about a production assistant on a film who is also a TikToker, or a viral TikToker, and she's a leftist, and she is just her job is destroying her. She has to drive on very little sleep, and so it's this kind of nail-biting, oh my God, is she going to get into an accident? But then she's also making these TikToks about fascism, and then she has to interview these kind of workers who have received compensation from it's a very, very complicated and really fun film. So I'm really interested in how global, transnational, et cetera, leftist filmmaking practices are consciously trying to bridge this gap and kind of refuse the kind of Hollywood style, Hollywood style kind of comforts, I suppose, formal comforts. But these are also films that are really popular. Like Radu Jude just had a film come out in Berlinale, and it's very exciting. His films are often talked about and discussed. They're enjoyable. I also, in a little bit of a different vein, I really like Brett Story's films. Brett's films are a little bit more kind of in the vein of early cinema verite. Like, she was very interested in Chris Marker. A lot of her work, I think, is an explicit kind of homage to Chris Marker. She had a film come out called Union about the first unionization of the Amazon warehouse in Staten Island. Unfortunately, this work cannot find distribution because it is about Amazon, and therefore it's going to be sued immediately. But it's had some, quite a bit of success on the circuit, and it plays in kind of one-off ways. And I think there is just something that the 1960s is just this source of influence for a lot of contemporary leftist filmmakers, and I find that really fascinating. Another example is a film called The Inheritance, which is by the currently Bard-based professor and filmmaker Ephraim Azili, and that film explicitly takes up the aesthetics of and the plot of Godard's La Chinoise, which is a film about 4 or 5 teenagers who start a commune in one of the kids' fancy apartment in Paris, and it's thought to be very prophetic of 1968. And so he's taking these aesthetic forms and translating them into the context of West Philadelphia, and specifically like a Black communist and more kind of anarchist collective in West Philadelphia. And so you have this fictional plot about these young people in West Philadelphia that are creating this commune inside the city, using the aesthetic forms connected to La Chinoise, but then there are extended sequences of documentary interviews where they interview the Move family. The Move family were, so Philadelphia is the only city in the United States to be bombed by its own government in 1985. And so it interviews the survivors of the Move bombing and talking about kind of the possibility of politics today. It's also just, all of these films are so fun. They're really beautiful. They're explicitly talking about the 1960s. There are many more that I can list, but I'll stop it at that. So, yeah.
Okay, do we have any questions in the audience here? Or I can take another question from Zoom.
You can,
Hi, Jen. Thanks for a great talk. I'm curious if you could talk about how, because I think this, what you've talked about in terms of Matsumoto's interest in kind of the exploring the interior, like the psychological, and how this film in particular is trying to sort of express that outwardly, right, through kind of these avant-garde expressive elements. So I'm curious because you also mentioned Funeral Parade of Roses, how, if you could talk more about how he specifically talks about gender or like age in kind of this anti-fascist, right, struggle, because I think with a lot of films that are very politically oriented, we tend to think about Marxism, we tend to think about class, and so I'm curious how you see that play out after doing all this research. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. I love that question, and it's actually the entirety of the 5th chapter of my book, which is on 1969 in Japan, and especially films that and I argue that they're queer. So like queer Japanese films in 1969, especially associated with the Art Theater Guild. I think, so Matsumoto did not write about gender explicitly. And it makes it very, very hard because the way that I was describing in that chapter, going through and looking at the archives and the journals, and it's like there's some connection to, I think, how Saidiya Hartman is looking at archives. Like I'm looking for the gap, often what is not stated. But I'm not reading the films as, and neither does, Jonathan Hall, and I connect to the way that he talks about how gender works in Matsumoto's films, not as liberatory in and of itself, but as a way that identity is fractured. And the way that queerness in those films, like it's very kind of, I think, might be uncomfortable for a lot of, let's say, like contemporary audiences, at least in the US, kind of North American context, to watch those films because there's something queer about them, but they're not celebratory and they're not identity-oriented, right? So I think Terayama, of the filmmakers that I discussed explicitly, and there are others like Okabe Michio's Crazy Rabu, but I love that one, but I don't treat it specifically in the book because of time. But Terayama, of the ones that I talk about, was the only one that was explicitly queer. But the film that I talk about, which is Throw Away Your Books, Rally in the Streets, and this title is amazing. It's just such a good title. There's something about it that is queer, and there is queerness represented. There are what we would call drag queens, gay boys, like in the film. But it's not celebratory of these identity markers. In fact, it's, I think, trying to bring the audience into this destruction of identity. And it's this kind of breaking apart of identity that I think was most interesting for Matsumoto with regard to the gay boys and the interviews in Funeral Parade of Roses, as you know, when he asks, or when the crew asks queer people in Japan in 1968, like, do you like being a gay boy? Do you want to become a woman? Or do you identify as a man? They all have different answers, and very few of their answers are kind of solidly like placed into a certain identity marker. Like there are very few of them. I don't think any are like, I feel like a woman. I think I was born a woman and I am a woman. They're like, right now I like dressing as a woman. I enjoy it. I don't think I would go through any other changes. I think I like the way that I am now. So it's this more kind of trans non-binary aspect to gender, which it's quite ahead of its time, but also just not something that I think it's more about this fracturing of identity more than it is a celebration of identification as such, But it does make it really hard to look at these films, which all do have this strong queerness behind it, but it's not queerness as a metaphor, but it's something else, It's kind of what this self-destruction can really do for you. And I think that is also, to go back to Marcus's question, connected to this more Buddhist kind of idea that connects to his later short experimental films. But Another film I talk about in the fifth chapter is one of my favorites that just never gets a lot of play, which is Hani Susumu's Morning Bell. And that film actually has rare for that time period queer women, and a more kind of in the vein of Jose Munoz or Heather Love, and a kind of a melancholy aspect to queerness. And it's already more at the tail end of this political period, which I think relates to the vibe of that film, the affects around that film. But I highly recommend that one if you haven't seen it yet. It's quite beautiful. But yeah, thanks.
Great. We have another question in the Zoom. Someone stole my question, so just kidding. An anonymous reviewer asks, could you please discuss the specific reception context of Anpo Joyaku beyond the political movement against the security treaty? Who were the intended audiences? What kind of venues was it screened in? For example, relating to community organization or demonstrations. And there's kind of a second part to this question, so you could break it up if you like. Were there many reviews in the media, mass or otherwise at the time? And if so, what was the critical reception behind the film?
Yeah, thank you. So Matsumoto was the editor of Kiroku Eiga. He founded it. He was behind a lot of it, and he chose to publish lots of both positive and negative reviews of Anpo. So there were both. So I think this aligns with his masochistic aspect, where sure, I'll publish these takedowns of my film. That's part of my ethos. The film was, I think, mostly screened within the context of, the documentary circuits, workers' halls. It was in connection with the Communist Party and what, it was trying to galvanize people to, to fight against Anpo. So it was in the context of worker organizing and of documentary filmmaking that it was screened. I don't know if it was actually screened in mass movie theaters. I'm not exactly sure about that, but there were many, many reviews that I read. I picked one in the interest of time, but there was an entire issue of Kiroku Eiga that was just reviews of Anpo. Of course, it's his newspaper, but it's also people writing in from all over the place, or his journal rather, and you see them in other journals too, not just Kiroku Eiga, but because it's a documentary film and grappling with a lot of these questions, people were really wanting to talk about it. And most people were quite positive. There were negative reviews in terms of some people argued against its incomprehensibility. This is a classic rejection of the avant-garde from the 1920s. It continues to this day. Can the working class understand what you're talking about? But actually, those were less frequent than the sort of more sadistic style of the film. I think some people criticized that more kind of the formal sadism, I guess. I find it quite pleasurable, but maybe some of those reviewers didn't. But there was a lot written about it. And Kiroku Eiga has, and there were reviews and connections to this film in several issues. For a year, people would not stop talking about it. His films were very, very, very discussed, I think also because he was just such an intellectual of his day. And, when someone who publishes so much has a film come out, people want to talk about it. So it was also, I think, this film served as a bit of a manifesto for his writings up to this point. Which is why I think it's especially important to look at. And also because it's such a difficult film to find, which I think makes it, especially important to take a look at it as a manifestation and mobilization of his embodiment of his theories. So the reception was positive to mixed, constantly in discussion, referenced for the next year or two at least. Then you kind of have more references to Nishijin. Nishijin from 1961 becomes the film that I think he's best known for a few years. Of course, Funeral Parade then becomes the one that we know him for today most of the time. But yeah, I think the Anpo film does become very kind of emblematic of his filmmaking for quite a few years after it came out. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Great. We have a question from Chloe.
Thank you. If I could just kind of like return to the kind of like line you were going through and the question that she asked relating to Funeral Parade of Roses, you kind of noted that like in a lot of the responses of the people interviewed, like there was this kind of like notable evidence of like, oh, well, like I'm not really in like a definable like gender state at the moment. It's kind of like more malleable. And there is like, you know, it's very, what is defined is like, I'm certain of that at least, you know? And so I'm wondering if you think that there's like a commonality between what you were talking about more in your presentation about like finding pleasure and like breaking down like kind of like an anti-fascist mentality versus like finding pleasure and like destroying like a gender binary. I wonder like if you can see like if there you think there is like a commonality between those in his films.
Yeah. I mean, you kind of answered your own question, which I love, and I think it's true. You know, I think there's so much about Funeral Parade that I find to be extremely joyful, even though the film, you know, like the story of Oedipus Rex, ends in tragedy with, you know, spoiler alert, like a blinding sequence, you know, but it's an extremely kind of. It's almost euphoric at times in the way that it presents this subculture of gay boys and in this kind of more underground countercultural nightclub scene. I think a lot about the sequence where Eddie, who's Oedipus, right? Eddie, played by Pita, who becomes this like very, very, very famous kind of talk show host and becomes this giant figure for Japanese pop culture. So when Eddie joins a bunch of her, pronouns awkward, but her friends who are gay boys and the political kind of activists and the filmmakers who are creating experimental films. So, right, they go to this party and they're all hanging out together and they do drugs and they watch an experimental film, you know. So it sort of shows how this world of political engagement and of art making and of like gender exploration and sometimes even sex work, you know, how all of these are actually interrelated worlds. And there's a very funny figure called Che Guevara in the film who has this fake mustache and he sneezes and it comes off, you know. So there's, but it's this like sweet critique of these very politically oriented filmmakers. Like there's another part where someone quotes who they call Mekas Jonas, and someone like bonks him on the head and says Jonas Mekas, you know. So it's just this real kind of embodied pleasure in this mixed space where activism and gender play and film creation and art creation are all combined together. So I find it like a very euphoric watch personally for a lot of the things that you've already mentioned. So yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, any other questions in the room? I can take the prerogative of the host to ask a question. So your book is comparative, very comparative, and involved a lot of archival work, a lot of making connections and going here and there. And I was wondering, first of all, if you found any cross-dialogue between Matsumoto and the other filmmakers that you treat in your book, and also if you could say a little bit about your archival, your experience doing the research, what your process was like.
Yeah, I love this question because I think I started, 15 years ago when I was in grad school. I was like, archives, and I was just kind of annoyed with the point of archival work. It's like, why do I have to sit in these libraries? Why do I have to go to the National Diet Library? It's so cold and it's so, the lighting is so bad. Oh, this is so unpleasant. But there's something, the more I did it, the more I really just believe in the exciting possibilities of archives. I spent a lot of time looking at microfilm, which is its own sadomasochistic praxis. I think microfilm is just so painful. But there's an embodiment. The labor is really important, I think, for the almost, there's something almost spiritual in the, going back to the question about Buddhism, about going through all of these pages. And there's something, there's something spiritual about it. But also I sometimes found, as I was looking at thousands of pages in French and in Japanese, and I'm looking at this microfilm, and I am just, my eyes are so tired. I'm like, feel like my brain is bleeding, you know, and I'm like crying. It hurts my eyes so much. But then I'll like notice a word, and I'm like, oh, interesting, you know, and then I'll like make these larger connections. And there's just so much that still hasn't been, you know, there's so much unexplored territory in response to how these things are connected to one another. It often felt like I was using archival documents as a Ouija board, and I was kind of like going to where it led me, which does not sound very academic, but somehow I feel like secretly this is how everyone does archives, and we're just not admitting how much of it is this mysterious like force that is making us move from one side of the page to the other. But like I spent years like looking at these archives, and then I like took some time away from it when I got my tenure track job, and then went back to them when I was on leave, and suddenly realized that what I was really looking for was the question of anti-fascism, and what I was seeing that was connecting these different texts was all connected to anti-fascism. And so there's just, there's something very mysterious about the archive process that I find, again, very, very important, like in terms of the embodiment of all of these texts, your experience with them, and the labor that's required. And there's nothing that really can compare to it. And there's something that's quite painful about it, but something but it's also something I like a lot. So I don't know if this answers your question at all, but there is something so that I find really, really important in the archive. And I don't think we go into an archive necessarily as some kind of blank slate, you know, objectively looking at everything, but we're coming in with our own desires. But it wasn't until I spent a long time really sitting with the archive that I kind of discovered the thread that links a lot of them. I will say that sometimes, you know, you asked about the links between these different people. So I haven't written about this. Actually, Yuri Furuhata wrote about this. But Chris Marker actually sent his film to Matsumoto Toshio. So he sent La Jetée to Matsumoto Toshio after he saw Matsumoto Toshio's Ishin no Uta at a short film festival in Tours in France. So this film festival doesn't exist anymore, but it did in the 50s and 60s, and it was this like hugely important short film kind of burgeoning filmmaker festival. Chris Marker saw that film and sent La Jetée to Matsumoto, and they were, unbeknownst to the two of them, both working on photo montage films. Agnes Varda was also working on photo montage films, and all of these films, miraculously, without, Chris Marker and Agnes Varda were friends, and Agnes Varda also had a photo montage documentary called Salut les Cubains, which I talk about in my book too. So 62 to 64 was this kind of, or actually just 62 and 63, a lot of photo montage documentaries and photo montage films were coming out. There was a lot of discussion of French communist filmmaking in Japan in the early 60s and in the late 60s, and I don't think the same was true in the opposite context. Like, they weren't reading Japanese periodicals, but they were watching Japanese films. But there was a lot. Matsumoto and Oshima and Hani Susumu were talking about what was going on in France in filmmaking and in theory all the time. So there was a back and forth. The theoretical back and forth was happening more from France to Japan, but the kind of filmic engagement was like circulating. And there was also a connection to Eastern Europe and Poland especially that both of them were interested in. So there were communications, but I continue to kind of press that this is not necessarily a question of influence, but really a vibe. Like, this is just like the time period created the necessity for this type of experimental art making practice, which you also see in different parts of the world, but isn't necessarily this clear influence-oriented question. So, yeah.
Great, thanks. We're at time, so please everyone join me in thanking Professor Alekseyeva for a wonderful talk.
Thank you, everyone. And feel free to come up and ask more questions, and feel free to send me an email if you have any other things to share. So thank you so much.